Welcome back to my X-Men series. For those of you who are new here, I'm going through each of the X-Men movies and reviewing them one by one. This is coinciding with both the series' 20th anniversary and the release of the final film in the franchise, The New Mutants, which is out in theaters now, but I currently can't see because theaters by me are still closed. Let me know what you think of the X-Men movies in the comments below, and make sure to give this a thumbs up if you like these reviews. It helps me out immensely. I already reviewed the first two movies, and I'll leave a link to that playlist in the description in case you missed it, and if you're new here, please consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with my reviews on the rest of the series. But now, let's talk about the third film in the franchise, X-Men: The Last Stand. This takes place not too long after the second movie, where a quote-unquote cure is announced that will suppress the mutants' genes and stop their abilities. This polarizes the mutant community, with some being interested, but Magneto, once again played by Ian McKellen, stages another rebellion, believing the cure will be forcefully administered to the mutants. Meanwhile, the X-Men are dealing with the sudden reappearance of Jean Grey, played again by Famke Janssen, who returns with mysterious new powers, the likes of which could be catastrophic to all life. Before we begin, we'll be discussing some spoilers in this review. I normally don't do this, especially with newer releases, but there are a number of plot details we need to talk about. So if you haven't seen this yet and don't want to be spoiled, here's your spoiler warning. But let's jump right in. This movie receives a lot of hatred from fans of the series and is usually ranked on the bottom tier of the X-Men movies. Between this and Spider-Man 3 the following year, it wasn't a great time to be the third movie in a successful superhero franchise. And I totally get the hatred. They kill off a bunch of fan-favorite characters, botch the introduction of newer characters, messes with the series continuity, and has a drastic shift in tone compared to the first two. That being said, I don't actually dislike this movie. Now, is it a major step down from the first two? 100% yes. This is not on the same level as either the first X-Men or X2, to be totally clear. Nor is it on the same level as some of the movies that came after it. And if you're a big fan of the comics, I totally get why you'd hate this. Given how famous the source material is, that being the Dark Phoenix saga, while I haven't read it, I know enough about it to know that this didn't do it justice. Funny enough, the writer of this movie, Simon Kinberg, went on to write and direct the second attempt at the story, Dark Phoenix, which was out last year, and all I'll say is, he's 0 for 2 there. But there are enough redeeming qualities here that I think makes it fairly enjoyable, if far from perfect. One thing we'll have to address right up front though is the shift in tone, which mostly stems from the crew from the first two movies not returning for this. Now, the first two movies, while not themselves perfect, were pretty dark, and they were both huge landmarks in the superhero genre because they showed you can be a superhero movie and not just be all out explosions and cool effects. There's character drama, psychological drama, there's even a slight horror aspect from time to time. They showcased a lot of emotional complexity and social commentary, such as dealing with prejudice, with some cool action scenes sprinkled in. This forgoes all those elements and instead just goes for being a straight up action movie. This puts all the cool fights and puts them right at the forefront. It feels like a typical summer blockbuster. There are a lot of explosions, huge showdowns, daring escapes, tense confrontations between characters. It leans heavily into all that without having too many moments to breathe like the first two movies did. Even the color palette of this movie is noticeably brighter than the first two. There are a lot more scenes taking place in broad daylight. There's an emphasis on nice looking locations with some wide shots of beautiful looking countrysides and big cities. It essentially becomes what the first two movies tried to subvert. It's not totally one-dimensional necessarily. There are some decently written arcs, but in terms of the series flow, this doesn't feel like a natural progression after the first two movies. But honestly, the action scenes are good. It's not as if they're not entertaining. The fights are well choreographed, especially towards the end when all the X-Men band together to take on the Brotherhood. I enjoyed all that. And for the most part, the effects aren't as dated as they were in the first two movies. You see in just a few years' time some of the improvements in technology. Like, there's a really awesome moment where the Brotherhood goes to rescue Mystique, and Magneto crushes the cars coming at him and tosses them to the side, and then derails the truck holding her. Those look great, and were probably one of Magneto's best moments in the entire series. That scene holds up to this day, though to be clear, not all the effects hold up. I'd say the worst part of the effects is the opening scene where we see a de-aged Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, and Patrick Stewart de-aged was done really well, but Ian McKellen, not so much. Now, unfortunately, as I said, this film lacks a lot of the emotional complexity that the other films had. Rarely do they ever have a moment where we can just explore how the characters are feeling. It moves extremely quickly, which is both one of its best and worst qualities, because while the action scenes are fun, the story feels rushed. But because we built up such a great connection to all these characters in the first two movies, it helps us care what happens here. Because if this was a standalone movie with totally new characters, or wasn't even an X-Men movie, it would fail. Action scenes alone would not be enough to save this. this. But the fact these characters are all already established helps make this feel exciting and make us care, and the performances are all great. The actors elevate the material and give us some emotional intensity that wasn't present in the writing, if only by so much. Hugh Jackman is once again top-notch as Wolverine. This puts him way more at the forefront this time around than the other two movies, which was another complaint this received. And I mean, Wolverine always was the breakout character in the franchise well before the movies, but even though this is a team movie, Jackman receives considerably more screen time here than any of the other X-Men, which is a little upsetting because all the other characters are enjoyable in their own right. But he still does a great job. Him trying to grapple with Jean Grey as the Phoenix and having to let go of his feelings for the person he knew was one of the better done arcs, even if it had its own issues, which I'll get to in a moment. And Ian McKellen was, once again, the other big standout. What makes Magneto such a compelling villain is that he has valid reasons to be so distrustful of non-mutants, and we see here just how deep that runs. The scene where Mystique gets shot with a cure is the best example of that. It happens when he was specifically going to rescue her, and even though he's thankful she saved him because the shot was aimed for him, the second she loses her powers, he's like, "You're not one of us anymore," and he just abandons her. And that's cold right there. That just shows he's so committed to his values that even though he was so close to Mystique for so long, the second something like that happens, which was out of her control by the way, he's like, "I'm done with you." That's a character with convictions right there. But what I also like too is, as things become more chaotic, especially as the narrative shifts focus to the Dark Phoenix stuff, we see him slowly start to realize he may have went too far in some regards. And that's not something that totally comes out of nowhere, because the first two movies never portrayed him as someone who completely lacks empathy. We're not actively rooting for him, I wouldn't call him a good guy so to speak, but the fact that he's friends with Xavier, and the fact he's willing to put differences aside in X2 to team up with the X-Men, and the fact his distrust of non-mutants specifically stems from his personal history, laid the groundwork to make the realization seem very natural. Everyone else was very good. This is the most Halle Berry has gotten to do as Storm. She takes on the role of Xavier's second in command, and she acts as the group's moral compass. She especially is the one who has the real Wolverine in as he tries grappling with his feelings over Jean. That goes hand in hand with what I was saying earlier about Wolverine as one of the better done aspects of the film. Also, Kelsey Grammer as Beast was honestly some spot on casting. He's a little funny, he takes over Cyclops' role as the guy who's trading insults with Wolverine. We see him show compassion, and we see how, even though he works for the government, just how committed he is to the mutants' cause. Of all the new characters, he was by far the best written. And as I mentioned earlier, the writing's not as great, but it's not totally one-dimensional. There are some solid arcs, like what I just mentioned. In fact, it even still manages to build upon the themes of the first two movies, as once again it explores discrimination. That's seen with this cure that the government tries to promote. They try to make it as if the mutants being born the way they are is inherently a bad thing, which it isn't. And that's a powerful theme to explore, and seeing the different ways in which the mutants react to it made for some interesting tension. You have Storm, who just scoffs at it and ignores it because she says there's nothing to cure. Magneto, who thinks it's going to be forced upon all the mutants, which is why he stages the battle he stages, while Rogue, once again played by Anna Paquin, is actually kind of interested in it, considering her powers don't allow her to touch anyone. So there are a lot of great themes and scenarios set up, which leads me to my criticism, that being they're not explored as deeply as they should have been. There was so much that they could have done with the cure storyline, but plotlines fizzle out, others don't get enough attention, and there are some stories we just didn't even need. For starters, even though we see Rogue grappling with potentially taking the cure, as it would allow her to have a better relationship with Iceman, she's ultimately treated like an afterthought here. There's this storyline they introduce in the first act where she's jealous of Iceman getting closer to Kitty Pryde, here played by Ellen Page, but it goes nowhere. I think they drop it halfway through. We see tensions beginning to rise between her and Iceman, and there's a great line where she angrily says how she's not able to touch him without hurting him, and they really should have just leaned more into that if they were going to have drama between the two. Anna Paquin is fine here, so is Ellen Page, and I liked what they did with Kitty Pryde in the second half during the battle with the Brotherhood, but this was a pointless storyline, and it just sidelines a subplot with Rogue that was honestly way better and should have been explored more. I also think Mystique is kind of just tossed to the side after the first act, which I get is part of the point with Magneto's storyline. Like I said, him abandoning her shows just how deep his prejudice against non-mutants runs, but we spent a good chunk of the first act with her, and then she's given the cure well before the hour mark, and that's it. We see her one more time very briefly when she's telling the FBI where the Brotherhood's base is, but after spending so much time with her in the first act, for her storyline to just fizzle out like that was disappointing. Also, we get introduced in the first few minutes to another mutant named Angel, who as an adult is played by Ben Foster. We get this great moment at the beginning with him as a child. He's making cuts into his back so that his wings can come out, and there's this brutal shot where we see these bloody cuts and him breaking down in tears over feeling like he's done something wrong. And we also realize he's the son of the scientist who created the cure, and it's such an emotional start to the film. But I've honestly never seen a bigger waste of a character in a movie, or at least a superhero movie. He's set up to be so important in the first scene, but he had to have been in the movie for maybe 5 minutes. He shows up in only a handful of scenes, and his only big contribution is he saves his dad after he's just pushed off a building. He otherwise just feels so disposable. We could have really explored the father-son dynamic in this storyline, and it amounts to nothing, especially after a great first scene. And this is on top of so many other characters getting introduced. There's a kid whose genes are used to produce the cure because whenever he's around someone, he suppresses their powers, but he's more of a MacGuffin than anything. Meanwhile, Magneto joins forces with so many other mutants with interesting powers, but all of them end up just taking on the role that Toad and Sabretooth had in the first movie, where they're just disposable lackeys of his rather than fully fleshed out characters in their own right. The only exception to this is Juggernaut, played by Vinnie Jones, which... I don't hate him. I know why a lot of people don't like him. It's probably the embodiment of how this movie is completely different in tone from the first two movies.
Don't you know who I am? I'm the Juggernaut, bitch!
He's definitely miscast, but it's not the worst thing I've seen. X-Men has gone on to do way worse than that. These storylines, though, get tossed to the side for the Dark Phoenix subplot, but the way it's incorporated into the story, it just feels shoehorned in. I'm not saying this had to be an exact recreation of the comics, especially coming from someone who never read the comic, but what I do know is this: the Dark Phoenix saga involves things like dueling personalities and mysterious, complex powers, and those are both seen here, but they barely scratch the surface on any of it. Famke Janssen is good here. I actually really enjoy her as an actress in general, but they don't do her storyline any justice. There's barely any sort of struggle between her regular personality and the Phoenix persona. You never see any scenes of them fighting with one another to be the dominant personality. She'll just occasionally switch off, be confused as to what's going on, and then go back to being the Phoenix. If anything, it's used more to boost Wolverine's storyline, as he's the one who has to struggle with being the one to kill her as her powers get worse and worse. And even that's not heavily explored. Jackman and Barry's acting as they're discussing it elevates the material, but most of these scenes amount to only a few lines of dialogue. Same thing with explaining Jean's powers. She's supposed to be the most powerful mutant they've ever encountered, and even if it wasn't a faithful recreation of what was done in the comics, it's explained away in like 2 sentences. So there never felt like there was any sort of emotional stakes. I was interested in it because I liked all these characters from the previous movies, and the performances gave an energy boost to the material, but this bounces back and forth so much between the Cure storyline and the Dark Phoenix stuff that rather than flesh out any character's feelings or emotions, it's all just wrapped up in a nice bow with 1 or 2 lines of dialogue. I think if they made this a much longer movie, they could have been able to incorporate both storylines and make it feel smooth, but this is about the same length as the first movie, only an hour and 40 minutes or so, and it has twice the amount of characters. It's just not enough time to fully explore either story. Like I said, it needed time to breathe, and while it was exciting and it was entertaining, it also has the first 2 movies to thank for building these characters up to stay invested. This is a mixed bag and there's a lot to be critical about, but honestly, I like it. Now, I can totally understand why people would dislike it, and there are valid criticisms. It doesn't do the Dark Phoenix saga justice, it's rushed, it tosses character subplots to the side, and doesn't have nearly as much as the depth as the first 2 films. However, there's still an emotional connection to the characters, mainly thanks to the great performances and how much we've grown to like them from the first 2 movies. And the action scenes are really well done. It moves quickly, and it's a fun blockbuster, which is both one of its best and worst qualities. I get why you may not like this, but I can watch it and still enjoy it, even if it's far from perfect. X-Men: The Last Stand gets a 7 out of 10. Up next, it's everyone's favorite X-Men movie, Certified Classic. I know it's something you're all going to be looking forward to. Not only one of the best X-Men movies around, but one of the greatest superhero movies around. It's X-Men Origins Wolverine. I'll have my review for that out within the next few days, along with more 2020 reviews coming soon. So let me know, did you see X-Men: The Last Stand, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you actually kind of like this movie? Did you dislike it? And what's one of your favorite movie trilogies? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll catch you next time.